the MuseScore Café for today, Wednesday, April 15th, 2020. My name is Marc Sabatella. This is my regular series of weekly chats that I do. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome, and to all my returning visitors, welcome to you too. What I usually do is pick some topic to talk about and say things about it, and we have discussion. If you're participating live in the chat, I'm always happy to answer questions on pretty much anything, and I always need to check my volume, and I seem to be broadcasting just fine. So the the topic that I had picked to talk about today. So the title I mentioned is a jazz hamburger, and I'll come to that in a second, I promise. But let me just tell you a little about the background of what I had in mind to be talking about. The idea is that, just getting up the chat where I can see it a little better. The idea is that there are a lot of sounds that, as jazz musicians, you all know that I'm a jazz pianist and composer, etc. And there's all these different sounds that you learn to create, different voicings, different rhythms, different things that you learn to do as a jazz improviser, as a jazz composer, and we associate these sounds with jazz, but the thing is, they don't need to be. That these sounds are just good, valid sounds, and there's no reason why someone who is composing in any other style can't be using these same sounds. We get hung up sometimes on, oh, jazz, I don't know how to do that. And really, maybe it comes down to improvisation. And whether or not you're an improviser, you can still use some of the sounds that I'm talking about in composition and bring it into other styles, and it works really well. Lots of people do this, and it works well. And so that's, I guess, some of the stuff that I want to talk about. So hello, everyone. Good to see you guys here. That is the goal of what I'm talking about, and I call these jazz sounds, but they're not necessarily. Most of the sounds that I'm talking about had their genesis in, say, late Romantic era classical music. A lot of these sounds came from Debussy or came from Chopin, and then were further adapted, or they maybe filtered through people like George Gershwin. Oh, that reminds me of, I guess, something else I need to pull up in here. So I'm gonna pull up my Rhapsody in Blue arrangement because it's pretty cool. Do I have I think I might even have done it in MuseScore 3. I didn't originally do it in MuseScore 3, but let's see if I have I don't have it in here. Anyhow, I'll keep trying to find it. The idea, Gershwin is like one of these composers who uh, as a classical composer, he was maybe not taken as seriously as he might have been otherwise because, oh, well, he dabbles in jazz. And as a jazz composer, he was maybe not taken seriously because he's a classical composer, but he was really, I think, maybe more important to the history of music than is sometimes given credit for. Howard, am I going to talk about orchestral usage? Absolutely. So, in fact, one of the scores that I have pulled up here is a score that I wrote when I was studying composition for my master's degree. And the score that I'm going to show you is the orchestral version that I wrote, and it's through composed. The very first project I ever did with MuseScore. In fact, literally was maybe the first score I ever saved, because I, just played around with it, trying to see how note entry worked, etc. But I probably never saved anything. The first real project I ever did was during the beta for MuseScore 1 back in 2011. And it was taking this orchestral score that I'm going to show you in a minute and doing a octet reduction of it. Was it an octet? Well, it was some smaller ensemble. And so this is this orchestral piece here that I wrote. And so this is actually imported from Finale. And, what I did, my first project was basically taking this import from Finale and then in MuseScore 1 trying to create this 8-piece reduction, or however, I think it was 8 pieces, but it was like, a jazz rhythm section plus violin, voice, and I can't even remember what the other instruments were. I think there was a saxophone. So let me make sure I'm keeping up with the comments here. I'm gonna talk about some of these things. So learns jazz swing rhythm. So okay, so certainly I can easily talk about some of these things as we go along. Some of them I might just say, well, let me get to that. Oh yeah, the so are you Howard? Are you a clarinet player? For some reason I maybe didn't realize that. But okay, let me play this little bit of this piece, and then you'll hear it with the swing. All right, so anyhow, that's the opening of this piece. If we wanted to hear that with swing, since I want it to apply to all the instruments, I will add it from the text palette. You'll see it says swing, and when I do that, let's hear it now. Oh, you heard that, Colleen? I guess I did. I do that. I didn't bring it into a rehearsal, did I? Did I just do it on a cafe long ago? Oh, well, it's recorded. You can always come back. But hopefully that answered your question. You just heard this, right? So it played the swing, and then if you right click on it, you'll see text. You'll see the properties, and you can adjust the percentages there. So anyhow, that's how you do it. Yes, I do have a metal clarinet. Someone dropped on my doorstep. They were moving out, and they knew we were musicians, and they were cleaning house, and they just dumped a pile of instruments on the front porch. One of them being a metal clarinet. Yeah, I always used to try to play that when I was in high school too, and I kind of learned how to do it. Um, okay, so yeah, so I want to talk about some of the different sounds that exist that we associate with jazz, and you know how you can deal with them. So one of them is things like, well, there's that big glissando. Um, None of the instruments were particularly valuable, I should say, but the metal clarinet was cool. It's more of a, it's not even a collector's piece. They were quite common back in the day, but most of them are long since fallen into disrepair. This one, could use some new pads, but it actually does work. Um, and the other instruments were just like really cheap student instruments. There was a flute and a tenor sax, I think, or an alto, I think, and something else I don't remember. Um, so the things like that glissando at the beginning of Rhapsody in Blue, right? So that glissando is a sound. Oh, the wedding party guy. Okay, cool, nice. Yeah, I'd forgotten that. Very nice. Um, so Colleen, I definitely know that you play clarinet. That technique of doing these crazy glissandos and smears and things like that. The thing is, you can write those all day long. The trick is getting people to play them who don't have jazz experience. So that is a tricky part about using a jazz sound if it requires special techniques, like doing these crazy glissandos and smears on trumpets and all these, half valve techniques. It's not that you can't learn them if you're not a jazz musician, but they're not part of your regular repertoire. So pretty often you would write that, and then people wouldn't necessarily do what you want. And certainly if you ask them to improvise, very often you won't get much. And that to me is a failure of the education system. Just to go on a little soapbox there, failure of the education system, that jazz musicians coming through school learn a fair amount of classical techniques and are expected to play in classical ensembles, and they learn a whole lot of stuff and end up being fairly well rounded if you go through the traditional university system, anyhow. But the reverse is not true. Classical musicians going through a traditional university music system typically don't learn much about jazz or improvisation in general, because that's the thing, is improvisation isn't specific to jazz. It's part of a lot of forms of music. I mean, Indian classical music is all about improvisation, and Bach is, of course, was well known as an improviser in his day, more so than as a composer. Maybe not more so, but equally so. But improvisation has sort of been, filtered out of classical music over the years. So anyhow, this actually lets me get into just where this term jazz hamburger comes from. So there's a musician, Anthony Braxton, and feel free to look him up. I think I'm not going to play a video of it because it's going to like cause YouTube to flag this and all this, but maybe I will later. I don't know. But Anthony Braxton is a musician who, for lack of any better term, typically gets lumped in with jazz musician because, well, A, he plays with musicians who play jazz, and B, there's improvisation in his music. He's occasionally swing, not necessarily. He's not necessarily the swingiest sort of guy, but he's much more. His relationship to jazz is like John Cage's relationship to classical music, where it's very, it's just different. He does his own thing. Let's put it that way. And so his music has improvisation in it, and maybe because there's jazz players involved, resembles jazz in some ways, but so much of what he writes is not in any way, shape, or form recognizable as jazz. And yet, people associate with him jazz. And so there's this associate with him with jazz, and it colors your perception of his music. And so there's this great quote from him, and I wish I knew exactly where it came from so I could find it in proper context. I thought I knew where it came from, but apparently I was wrong because I tried looking it up and it wasn't there. And the quote goes like this: he was bemoaning the fact that he's labeled as a jazz musician, and therefore everything that he ever writes or creates is interpreted through that filter. And what he said was, if I write an opera, then of course they're going to say it's a jazz opera. If I write a string quartet, it's a string quartet. And if I eat a hamburger, it's a jazz hamburger. So anyhow, that is the idea, that just because something is associated with jazz, that doesn't necessarily mean it's jazz or has to be jazz. And so I want to talk about some sounds. So that's enough meta talk about what I want to talk about. Let me talk about, in this orchestral piece, the very end of the piece. Let's see, where is it? It's this final string thing. So I'm going to play the kind of finale of this so you kind of hear where it's coming from. I think if I start here, you get the idea. Actually, let me start a measure earlier. It's not supposed to be swinging, but whatever. Okay, so I could ask you, I have that silly swing text at the beginning now. Let me get rid of that. I could ask if that is in any way, shape, or form jazz, and I think if I hadn't even said the word jazz, you would have said, no, of course not, right? There's nothing that's obviously jazz about that other than that silly bit of swing there. But I want to focus on a couple of specific things here. One of them, no, I don't want to turn on sticky keys, is this, and it says very slowly, but I need an actual tempo marking to make it do that. Actually, let me just bring up the play panel. Is that F11? F11. Play panel, there we go. I'm going to turn the tempo down rather than entering in a tempo tech, because this way I'll be able to control more things easily. All right, I just want to play that final string thing here. Okay, just that. I would say that the way I wrote this particular part here is not specifically jazz, and yet it's a typical jazz arranging technique that jazz musicians use all the time. And I won't say no one else ever uses it, but it's it's a technique that's not necessarily taught as such. Um, and what it is it's what's called drop two voicings. And so, Colleen, you're familiar with these, I know. Um, Actually, is it a drop two voicing? I think it is. No, it's about drop three voicing. Actually, it's a drop two and four. Anyhow, it's a particular form of voicing in which I have this chord that is a G minor. Is it a G? No, it's a B flat minor sixth chord. It's a B flat minor sixth chord, which in itself is such a jazz ism. And yet it doesn't have to be. It's not like I think I mentioned in when I was talking about the Beethoven Pathétique a few weeks ago. Beethoven used a minor sixth chord very prominently at a similarly climactic spot of that second movement of Pathétique. It's just a beautiful chord, and yet it's sort of associated with jazz now. But it's this. That is B flat minor 6 resolving to F major. And my F major chord has a ninth added. So it's a major ninth chord. So there is, in the context of this piece, there's nothing about it that makes you say jazz. And yet I'm using sounds that totally come from that world that you might not have thought of using otherwise. So part of it is the minor sixth chord itself. The other part is the voicing of it. When you're voicing a chord across a string section like this, you have instruments that have different ranges, and so you use what are called open voicings. So these are all the same chord. These are all the same chord. If I did it right, which I would like to think that I did, every single one of them should be a B flat minor 6. So let's look at this. B flat, D flat, F, and G. So every single one of them is B flat, D flat, F, G. They're just, the notes are spread. And they're spread so that we're descending an arpeggio. So this one is, here's, you can see the chord very clearly here. B flat, D, whoops, B flat, I don't know where my cursor went. B flat, D flat, F here, and then there's the sixth. So we have this B flat minor triad, we have a sixth. And so that's what, and this is the same thing, an octave higher. And then, but this is that same arpeggio starting on the B flat. This is that same arpeggio starting on the G. This is the same arpeggio starting on the D flat. The very last note, finally, it puts a 5 kind of underneath it to give you a final sense of 5 to 1. So it's just that B flat minor sixth chord arpeggiated, and it's arpeggiated with the notes spread out. We have, if you think about the notes bottom to top, if I wanted F to be in the melody, if I wanted to create, I'm going to use the harp for this. If you wanted to create E flat, D flat, F. This is the chord here. F on top, then D flat, and then B flat, and then G. And those are the notes here, but they're spread out. So we have an F here, but then instead of the next note being a D flat, the next note down is the B flat. And then we have the G. And then we finally have the D flat. Lower. It's an octave lower. It's actually 2 octaves lower because cello couldn't have played it in the octave that it might have otherwise have been. So this is that same chord. So this is called a close position chord. But you can't write for 4 strings with close position chords like that, because if you do that, it's going to be, the cello would not be able to play that note at all. And of course, with the thing this high, I even had to play games with the octaves even then. But so when you're writing for a mixed ensemble like that, strings where you have violins as well as violas as well as cellos, the cellos are basically going to sound an octave below the viola, which is like a fifth below the violins. You need to spread the notes out more. So the term for that is a close, well, this is called a close position voicing. These are called open position voicings when you have the notes spread out. And typically in an orchestration course, you might just learn it that much and say, okay, if you spread the notes out, it's open. But you don't necessarily learn specific techniques for opening these voicings. Or maybe you do, maybe you don't. But in jazz, you definitely learn very specific techniques. And this one is one of the most common ones, which is, oh, good job there. Nice, catching up. Um, so what happens is I'm taking the second to top note. It's the D flat that should have been here between the F and the B flat. I take that D flat and drop it down an octave. So I'm taking the second to top note of the structure, dropping it down an octave, or actually, because it's cello and it was so high to begin with, I dropped it 2 octaves. If I dropped this another octave, we'd have a literal so that would be a literal drop 2 voicing, because now the cello's only 1 octave. It is only, actually, yeah, now the D flat should have been here, the 4th line D flat of treble clef, and it got dropped 1 octave here. If I tried taking the cello up an octave, I could do that too. It's it's not really playable, but so anyhow, this idea of a drop 2 voicing is such a jazzism, and it's not that it never happens in other styles of music, but it happens almost more accidentally. Like, well, I got to spread the notes out somehow, and you might happen to end up with that shape. You don't necessarily set out to create that shape, but you do in jazz arranging. It's one of the basic techniques you learn, and also as a jazz pianist or a guitar player, you learn to play these things because they fit 2 hands very nicely. And then this idea of taking a descending arpeggio and playing that whole arpeggio in drop 2 voicings, which is what I'm doing here. This is another one of those jazzisms where you basically don't just play one chord that way, but you play a whole sequence of chords that way. So that's like one of these kinds of sounds that I'm talking about. But I want to show you other, I guess I need more. Let me add some. I think I'm going to add. I'll keep using strings because why not? A violin, a viola, a cello, and we'll go ahead and add a bass because why not? All right. So I can take a scale. No playback. I've been using Zoom and doing all these other things, and my settings are getting messed up periodically. Let's see if that helped. There we go. All right. So if I want to then take a C chord, I want to orchestrate this scale and harmonize it. This is a real common jazz technique that again is perfectly applicable to any style, where I want to harmonize this thing with basically a C chord. And I want there to be a C chord while I play this whole scale. Because if I can play a scale, I can play a melody, right? So it's not all about scales. But if you can do it with a scale, you can do it with any melody. So what I'm going to do actually is I am going to build this thing up. I'm going to build up a chord. This is a 5-note chord. And what I'm doing is I'm adding a 6th to it. Because this idea of adding 6ths to chords or adding 9ths to chords, another jazzism. And I'm going to take every other note in here, whoops, not that one, and voice it that way. You'll see why in a minute. Whoops, not that one. Oops, I wanted 5-note voicings. So each one of these wants to have the melody note doubled. Add an E, add a G, add an E. There we go. All right. Now, let's listen to this for a second. All right, I'm going to go ahead and double these. All right, so what I've done is I've taken all the notes that are actually compatible with that C6 chord, and I've harmonized them using a C6. So I've got a C major triad with an A. So when I say C6, I mean jazz C6, a chord with a sixth in it, not first inversion triad, if you're thinking six meaning that, just different terminology. So I've taken all the chords that are actually part of a C6 chord, all the notes that are part of a C6 chord, and I'm harmonizing them using the entire C6 chord with the melody doubled on top. So that's what I'm doing here. But then the question is, well, what do I do with all these passing notes? Well, the typical jazz thing to do is use passing diminished chords. So I'm going to fill this thing with B diminished. So my chord progression basically is the technical term for this would be a prolongation in a classical context, and we sometimes see it as 1-5-1-5-1, but I'm not going to use 5. I'm going to use the diminished chord, which is essentially the same. B diminished. If I make this B diminished, F, crap. I guess I have to move all these things down octaves. I'm actually going to use mouse entry, which I never do. And that's why I don't. There we go. So now when I play this, yes, this idea of alternating these sixth chords with passing diminished chords like this is definitely a Barry Harris-ism. It's not like he invented the technique. I don't know who maybe would get credit for inventing it if you could really, I don't know if it's traceable even. Thad Jones as an arranger probably also, but Duke Ellington surely used some variation of this also. But Barry Harris teaches it as a piano technique, which it totally is. So I have alternating basically C6. Where'd my play panel go? I want my play panel back. There it is. Okay. Because this way I can just do what I want with the tempo without needing to edit tempo markings. All right. So I have now harmonized that entire scale by alternating this major sixth chord with that passing diminished chord, this B diminished chord. And the reason I said it's really kind of interchangeable with a 5 chord, if I add a G to that on the bottom, now you see it's G, B, D, F, that's G7. And yes, it's got a flat 9 on it. A jazzism to put a flat 9 on a chord, but come on, it's really just B diminished. It's that 7 chord, but you're putting the 5 in the bass. Bach did that. Beethoven did that. It's not a jazz thing necessarily. It just sort of gets associated with jazz, and yet totally you're going to see this all over Bach. Not as a single chord played like that, but as an arpeggio that runs up from the 5 all the way up to the flat 9. Absolutely, you'll see that. You'll see that in Beethoven. You'll see it in Pathetique, for that matter, in the first movement, right at the end of the Grave introduction. So, but for various reasons, when we're using this technique, we typically don't actually use that note, at least not directly. So we have this passing diminished chord. And the other thing that we might do, if you're going to play just the scale, you notice you end up with 2 notes in a row. That, okay? You end up with 2 notes in a row that are now the same chord because there wasn't room for a passing chord between them. For various reasons, that bothers people enough that we often insert that passing diminished chord here. So I'm going to do that. So I'm not saying you necessarily have to play this as your melody, but it gives you another option, because this note, A flat, is arguably the single most important non-diatonic note that you can incorporate into your music. So this note, not A flat in particular, but the flatted sixth scale degree, it's borrowed from the minor key. All sorts of amazing, wonderful uses for it, like that in Dusk that I was showing you a minute. I'll get to your question in a minute, Jay. In Dusk here, this was, I said, a B flat minor chord. Well, we're in the key of F. There's no key signature because it's not consistently in F. But at this point, this is B flat minor to F. That's 4-1 in F. But it's not major 4. It's minor 4. We're borrowing this D flat that doesn't belong in the key of F major. It comes from F minor. It's the flatted sixth scale degree. Another jazz-ism there. And then making it a sixth chord is another jazz-ism. So I'm basically gonna claim that this A flat is just a powerful note because it's going to be used as part of that minor 4 chord, as well as other reasons like its use within this passing diminished chord. So it's a great note to have, and we might as well incorporate it. Whether or not your melody includes that A flat or not, well, fine, it doesn't matter. But if it does, we can see how we can harmonize it. So the resulting scale here is sometimes called the bebop scale. So yes, every single diminished chord could be looked at. You could just throw another third underneath it and have it as a flat 9 chord. The thing is, in this case, I have a B diminished chord, and if I throw a G underneath it, it actually makes sense. Sorry, if I throw a G underneath it, then it actually makes sense to have 5-1. But not all diminished chords work that way. Like another common diminished chord we might see here is, let me get rid of that note. I've got a diminished chord here. Get rid of the G totally. If I take this chord and I'm going to move it up to B, that's C diminished, D diminished, D sharp diminished. All right, this is also, nope, I must have got something wrong. E diminished, D sharp diminished. All right. So this chord here, a D sharp diminished, going into that C chord is also a really common idiom. And if I wanted, I guess I should respell this thing with sharps so we can see it as D sharp diminished. That's also a common sound. But if I wanted to look at it as some sort of dominant 7th chord with a flat 9, it's B7. But B7 going to C doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense. B7 going to E does, and so there's ways of looking at it that cause it to make sense. But realistically, the bottom line is not all diminished chords actually make sense to look at that way. Yes, you can put a note in it and say, oh, it's just like B7. But now you're stuck saying, well, wait a minute, why is there a B7 here? Why can a B7 chord resolve to C? That doesn't make sense. It does only if you do additional substitutions. So sometimes it's better just to call it a passing diminished chord and be done with it. But that's a question of what to call it. I'm less interested in what to call it. So the classical theory text will make a distinction between passing diminished chords, which is what that is, and secondary diminished, which is what this is. I'm not interested in that distinction. I'm just going to call them diminished approach chords. They are diminished chords that resolve by step to the next chord where they're going, and then I'm happy with that term. All right, so good. I'm happy that someone is answering a question here. Irrational time signatures. I don't even know what you mean by that, but so yeah, I don't even know what you mean by an irrational one. If it's a fraction, it's rational. That's the definition of fraction. Pi is an irrational number. Pi over 4. That would be irrational. Yeah, Howard's definitely one of the developers. So, the whole idea with open source software is the team is what the team is. Anyone who contributes to it's part of the team, and there's a nice broad team. But yeah, if the goal is things like to make a quintuplet be your basic unit of measure, no, you basically make it just hide the quintuplets. All right, so this sequence here, as far as the chord voicings go, is already jazzy. So Jay, you still haven't explained what you mean, but if you do mean something like 5/20, fine. You can do it in MuseScore too. As I said, just call it call it 5/4 and add quintuplets and hide the quintuplets, and you can get that effect. Musicians won't be able to read it though, so it's not really to your advantage to do it. I have this sequence of notes, and it's already, by how I harmonized it using these alternating diminished chords and adding sixths everywhere, by doing that, it's already jazzy. But now I want to make these drop two voicings, and I'm taking the second to top note all the way across and dropping it an octave. And this is one of these cases where, yeah, if we had a select second to top note command or something that's been requested every once in a while, that would make this marginally faster, but whatever. So now I have drop two voicings. And then I can take this whole sequence and I can use explode. And now all these notes are scattered for my instruments. And when I do that, you can see that they are actually far too high for the cello and bass. As I said, it's that technique. If you want to apply it to a string section, you're going to have to make additional adjustments. But let's hear it. The way I would really do it for strings is I would actually give the first two notes probably to the first violin, and the third note to viola, fourth note, no, second, but yeah, first two notes I would, as a violin section, I would do a divisi on it, so that the first two notes were the violin section, or maybe the top note would just be first violins, and then the second and third note would be split in the second violin part, and then so actually let me just do that again. If I do this, I can then implode these parts to combine them again. Tools, implode, and then I can cut this and paste it here, and I have something a little more reasonable. So I'm basically making the second violin part do a divisi to fill out my 5-note chord. So lower the A flat. Oh, okay. I didn't even see. Oh, I see. You did say A flat before, but I made the A flat. Okay. Yeah, Colleen, if there's some other question about the A flat, oh, why would it have G? Okay, so anyhow, hopefully you've answered your own question. If not, or maybe I messed something up. That's also possible. So anyhow, this is now playable. It's still awfully high for the cello, but awfully high isn't the same as unusable, and that's only because the melody went fairly high. If the same thing was a G scale, now it's a little more manageable. Let's start at the beginning. So Jay, you can definitely swing 16th notes. You just have to go into your swing settings and just go into your swing settings, and so you right click the swing text and you can set it to be 16ths, because normally swing is either 8ths or 16ths. You wouldn't swing them both because then they wouldn't line up. So a piece is by default going to swing 8ths, but if you want it to swing 16ths, just go into the swing options on the swing text, and it will happily swing the 16ths instead. Yeah, so now this is a better range for that sort of thing. But if I undo all this business and get back to have here, this was a drop 2, but another technique is called drop 2 and 4. So now I'm going to take the what was, well, if I, this was, the E here was the 4th note before I dropped it, so I'm going to drop that note an octave also. So it's really the third from top note now. And so if I'm dropping the third from top note down an octave also, this was the 4th to top note before I did the drop 2 on it. Now if I do an explode on the drop 2 and 4, I get a bigger voicing. And this one actually, it's still awfully high on the bass, but it's actually more manageable. Okay, see you, Jay. So this drop 2 and 4 is an option when you're trying to create a really big or expansive voicing for a whole violin section, a whole string section like this. It's still going to be the case that if you're literally trying to get notes above the staff harmonized and you've got a bass as one of your instruments, you're dealing with a huge differential in the range of these instruments, and this is still pushing it. But again, this scale, this now, if I let me drop it down an octave and then take it up to G. This is actually going to be nice and full. Start. Did my video stop? Oh. Stop streaming. It says I'm streaming. Do I have an internet connection? So I think I'm still going. I'm listening. But it does look like my picture's frozen, but I'm still giving you sound, right? All right, I don't know, temporary glitch. So anyhow, there's a million different techniques that one could talk about, but just looking at what we've looked about here, it really touches on quite a lot of them. One of them is this idea of adding sixths and ninths to chords, because that's absolutely a thing, right? I mean, this is totally totally a thing to add sixth and ninth freely to chords. And the fact that when we had the 5 chord, it was really a flatted ninth, and that's coming from the diminished chord. And this is Bach, this is Beethoven, this is not jazz, but it's just associated with jazz. It's that jazz Hamburger thing. So those are sounds that I'm using these sixths, using the ninths like I used at the end of Dusk. So here you heard both a sixth on this chord and a ninth on that chord. And I guess I achieved that using a double stop. Not a double stop, but a divisi. I could just as easily have wanted to put a major seventh on that chord, but with a root in the melody, I elected not to. But I used any number of major sevenths. Because in a jazz context, you're going to use major sevenths practically all the time. Oops, I wanted to go back to the beginning, and I guess I didn't click. So starting here, this here is an F chord, but with an E in it. So that's a C. If you're not reading alto clef, that's a C. So we got an F, we got an A, we got a C, and we got an E, a major seventh. We're gonna have these major sevenths. I'm glad you're still here, Jay. Oh, and I had actually put on the swing text on this one, but then I deleted it. But I don't know that there's any 16th notes in this entire piece. But just so you can see it in action, if I add a text here that says swing, I'm just doing it that way rather than the palette because I'm going to have to change it anyhow. Go to Staff Text Properties. Under Swing Settings, I can tell it swing 16th notes. And now the 16th notes will swing instead of the eighths. So there you go. Anyhow, this idea that this chord has got a major seventh on it, adding the major seventh to the chord if the root is not in the melody, that's like a really common, useful thing. Oh, and that's another thing. Change the name of an instrument, right-click it. Right-click the staff or the name of the instrument, staff text properties, or staff part properties, and you get all these properties, including the long name at the beginning of the score, their short name elsewhere. So Jay, I want to make sure that you know about the support forum. Instead of waiting a week to ask questions on the Café, definitely go to the support forum on musescore.org. You'll probably get your answered within minutes. So I'll highly recommend it as a way of getting just general questions answered. That's always the fastest best, fastest way. Um, yeah, so that idea that we're going to add major sevenths to chords, or add sevenths in general to chords, once we understand the function, we know if you understand the harmonic function of the chord, you'll have a better idea whether it should be a major seventh or a minor seventh interval above the root to add. But then also adding these sixths and adding these ninths and adding them as flat ninths and flat 13ths. Oh, there's another thing. So like, let me just show this quick example here. Of again something that's not specifically jazz, but it's like jazz musicians rely on this and other people are surprised by it. I'm gonna create myself a C minor chord, C, E flat, G, C. If I then, oops, no, I don't want a C minor chord. I want a C major chord. If I want to put a G chord leading to this, I'm trying to do good voice leading because, I don't want to disappoint my teachers. All right, this is a doubled root, no fifth. All right, or actually, I don't want to double the root. I'm going to take this down here. So this is fine. This is 5-1 in the key of C major. All well and good. But I talk about adding ninths. I talk about adding sixths to chords, or 13ths. What happened to renaming right in this? Once upon a time, you could double-click an instrument name, and it would try to edit it in the score. The reality is that trying to do that triggered one of the worst bugs in MuseScore ever, which would actually result in removing your entire score. It messed up everything about the internal data structures in MuseScore so badly that the next time you saved your score, it would be destroyed. And figured out a way to fix that bug, so that is why that feature was removed, because it destroyed people's scores, basically. That's the long and short of it. It's because these names here aren't real. They are generated on the fly. Because, like right here, this name is associated. That sticky keys thing, I gotta make that go away forever. This is associated with measure 5, but that's because there's a line break here. If I remove that line break, now measure 5 no longer has a staff name associated with it. And so staff names come and go. And so if you change the name of something, you might be changing the name of something that doesn't exist by the time you change its name, because changing the name of it might have increased the size of things, and then and now that measure doesn't need a staff name anymore. So yeah, the bugs that came from that were horrific, and there you go. So it's back where it always was. It was only that way for a few months, or maybe a year or two, because it always has been within the staff properties. So anyhow, I've got this 5-1 here. 5-1. All right, now I can go back to full tempo. Oh, by the way, double click? Yes, double clicking a slider in many cases will reset it to its default value. Not always, but it does in some places, like there. So if I want to add a ninth, I can add a ninth. That's an A. But if I do that, yeah, it's a reasonable trade-off. Really, it would be nice if someone figured out how to get around it and fix it, but it was more than we could deal with at the time, because we were trying to get MuseScore 2 out the door. Is when, well, no, 3, I forget when it happened. But there was some release when we were trying to get out the door. We realized, oh my God, we need to fix this, and no one could find an easy fix, so they just disabled it. So I've got this A here, and this is technically the ninth of this chord, and in the key of C major, this is fine. Nothing wrong with the A. But in the key of C minor, we've already said C minor has E flats in it and it has A flats in it. It'd be really nice to borrow a little of that sound. It's just this darkness, this little bit of darkness that major keys like to borrow from minor keys. The reverse is true also. Minor keys love to borrow some brightness from major keys. That's where harmonic minor comes from. That's why that leading tone is a thing in minor keys, because minor keys want that brightness of the leading tone. Also, you know about maybe the Picardy third, the fact that a song in a minor key might have a major chord at the very end of it. Most of Bach's pieces that were in minor keys keys did that throughout the Baroque era. That was the expectation. So minor keys like to borrow that major seventh and major third. Well, major keys like to borrow this flatted sixth scale degree. Listen to what this sounds like now. It's this ba resolving down there. So this sound here is a huge part, this G7 with the flatted ninth. Again, it's just taken for granted in a jazz context that we can add flat nines to our dominant seventh chords like this. And it's a sound that is technically taught in any music theory textbook, any classical theory textbook. You'll learn about that as a borrowed note, mode interchange. There's all these different terms that are used for it, but you'll learn about it and forget it. But it's a huge part of the jazz language. There's no reason it couldn't be part of, you know, your language for anything else. Jay, I answered that question already. So if you scroll up, you'll see the answer. You need to go into the staff text properties and change it from eighth note to 16th note. Quaver is British for eighth note. Semiquaver is British for 16th note. So when you go into, I'll do it again. You go in here and you right click here, staff text properties, swing. You'll see that you can turn on whether it's eighth note or 16th note that swings. So that's how you get it to do that. Typically, eighth note is how you swing things. So that's why that's the default when you add a swing text, but you can change it. So we have, and I also was trying to tell you that the support forum is really the great place to go where you can get questions all week long answered within minutes. So definitely recommend you go to musescore.org and visit the support forum because yeah, it's amazing. There's questions asked, you know, every few minutes there's a question asked, and within a few minutes there's an answer up. It's just an amazing just resource that's up all the time, so that you don't have to wait for Wednesdays for answering questions. You can get them answered anytime. Okay, so cool. So yeah, that flat 9. And the other note that's really cool is the flat 13th. Instead of D, I'm going to add E flat. And I'm going to call it flat 13 here because if I think of it as being borrowed from the minor key, same thing. In the key of C minor, we have an E flat. So this chord is also a thing. E flat resolving to E is also a thing. Well, thanks, and that I'm definitely an online teacher, and this is what I do. So I'm always happy to be doing this, and I'm expanding. As you've probably seen, I've got like theory courses, and I'm going to be doing some other online trainings and stuff on various different things that I'll be announcing soon, also. So this E flat also comes from the key of C minor, this E flat liking to resolve to E. So that's another typical thing, adding what's basically a flat 9 or a flat 13 to your dominant chords to give them just this extra color. However, from a voice leading perspective, this E flat resolving up to E, we often spell it differently to make that voice leading more clear. We spell it as as D sharp, because it's resolving up. And so in that case, it's sharp 5 rather than flat 13. And we now see this as an augmented chord, G, B, D sharp. So using the 5 chord as an augmented chord to get to 1. Again, it's a technique you might learn about in a classical theory text, but you learn about it and like, oh, that's something I could do once in a blue moon. Now, in jazz, you do it all the time, and there's no reason you have to save it for the blue moon in any other music. So if we go to my piece, Reunion, which many of you are familiar with because I play it often. Just in that little section here, you get to hear several of those things that I talked about. Here, we have this basically a D7 chord, but with a flat 9 on it because it resolves nicely there. It resolves to this G minor chord here. So it's the exact same sound. Here is that in the key of F. Here's that B flat minor 6th. There's our 6th. So it's this minor 4 chord, in which there's also a C, the 9th. So I'm using both a ninth and a sixth on a minor 4 chord. The minor 4 chord itself, centuries old, but a huge part of the jazz language. Adding 6 to it, huge part of the jazz language. Adding a ninth to it, huge part of the jazz language. I think here I have an A7 chord, an A7. We have A, C sharp, and G, right? That's the root, the third, and the seventh of an A7 chord resolving to D. But here we're getting an F on that. That's that augmented, that's that flat 13. In this case, it's resolving down to E, which is why I spelled it as F. This line is going F sharp, F, E. F sharp, F, E. So it's resolving down. I'm spelling it as a flat 13 instead of a sharp 5. If this was resolving up to the F sharp here, I would have spelt this maybe as E sharp instead. So, is there better auto ties? What do you mean by auto ties? Because it's already the case that if you enter a note across the bar line, it will tie it for you. I'm going to make a guess, well, because I know there's a little lag here, but I'm going to make a guess. Maybe you want to be able to enter, say, for a 3/8 notes, and now you want a quarter note here, and you want it to be the case that if you enter a quarter note, that it's smart enough, like this one entered the tie across the bar line. This didn't, because you told it a quarter note. It's going to give you a quarter note. But we know that you shouldn't spell it as a quarter note, right? Because it's straddling beat 3. You should split it up. Well, I got your fix for that. Select this passage. Go to Tools. Is it under Tools? Yes, Tools, Regroup Rhythms. And now it broke that up with a tie for you. So that's the only thing I can think of. So MuseScore will generally, if you type a quarter note, we'll enter a quarter note. That's how most people want it. You want to be in control. But if you want MuseScore to be able to fix things for you afterwards, Tools Regroup Rhythms will do its best. It's not perfect, but it's something. So hopefully that answers that question. So anyhow, those are this idea of adding color tones to chords, not just occasionally, but regularly. Because if you don't do it consistently, then the chords that have the extra color kind of stand out, and then it makes you not want to do it. Because, oh, that chord sounds unlike everything else, so I better not do it too much. But if you do it all the time, then nothing stands out. It just sounds rich. And so if we look at Reunion here, I mean, I've got right off the bat, why are there accidentals at the beginning? Well, I'll tell you why. We're in the key of F. I'm implying a C7 chord, and I'm putting a flat 9 on it. I'm borrowing this D flat and the E flat from F minor to give this darker sound. And then right here, I'm giving you a ninth on this chord. And then here I've got what's basically an E flat triad, and it's got these other color tones, a sharp 11 and a 6. I'm adding these color tones not just occasionally, everywhere. Here, this is a B flat triad, a B flat major triad. B flat, D, F. And yet I've got a ninth on it, here and here. I can justify all of this from a classical perspective too. This is a C left over from the previous chord hanging over the line and then resolving down a step. That is a 9/8 suspension in classical terms. So it's not like these sounds don't exist, but they get relegated to like special purpose things rather than just used completely consistently everywhere. And so anyhow, these are the kinds of sounds that I might mean. So all this talk about swing is great too, because if you write the word swing, and MuseScore will play it for you, and if you give musicians that, if they play jazz, they might actually sound good on it. I will say your typical classical musician, if you tell them to play swing, it's not going to sound that good, because if you, the deal with swing is, and actually let me talk about that another, just a final little thing about rhythm. If I write some eighth notes, I don't know what, I mean, I at some level know what I'm doing. I'm making, oh, I see what I did. I doubled the E. I'm using that bebop scale is what I want to do here, but I don't want to double that E, so I'll paste right over it. Okay. If I say I want to swing that thing and I add a swing text, the default in MuseScore is a 60% swing ratio. So, unfortunately, if you have a more complicated chord, the ties often clash with the notes. Oh, as far as yeah. So if the chord has seconds in it, like my chord here, if this chord here needed to get tied, I can tell you right now that indeed bad things happen. I think this is what you mean. Um, So in this particular case, I got a little bit lucky. The ties managed to avoid each other, but it wouldn't take much more to create situations, yeah, like this now, where these ties are looking weird. I didn't mean to delete the other ties, but um, yeah, I kind of got lucky here. Too. Oh, I wanted to add another G here and tie it. And if I do that, if I tie that G, yeah, you start getting overlaps and things. So yeah, it's true if if you've got a cluster of chords that they're going to overlap, then yeah, there are certain times where you're going to have to do some manual adjustments. And yeah, we know that that's something we'd like to fix, but I don't. I don't have a plan for it. I did a ton of improvement as one of my first real projects contributing to MuseScore as a programmer. The very first one was chord symbol parsing, so that you could type G7 flat 9 flat 5 or G7 flat 9 flat 5 and it would understand it either way. Um, and lots of other things like that. But so other than chord symbol parsing, the first thing I did was made improvements to a lot of other aspects of ties. Like it used to be the case in MuseScore 1, if I had 16th notes and then a tied 16th note, this tie here would be too short. It would try to draw in between the notes there and it would be too short. So anyhow, I added code to like make sure those ties were going to be longer and fixed a lot of other cases like this. But basically, and this was like 5 years ago, but this was something I never came up with a good solution for, is these complicated clusters that are tied. And I just sort of haven't returned to it since, and hoping someone else will take me up on it. All right, so I was going to talk just about swing for a minute. So that ratio there is percent. If I go to System Text Properties, Swing Settings, it's set to eighth note 60%. That means within each beat, the first half of the beat is getting 60% of the duration. This is 40%. 60, 40, 60, 40 is the ratio. At this tempo, that's too exaggerated. Realistically, most people first learning swing think of it as triplets. Bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. That's triplets is a 67% ratio. So I would need to change this to 67% to sound like triplets, but it's even worse. That's not swing. That is not what swing sounds like. That is not what jazz players sound like when they swing. At least certainly not at that tempo. Maybe at a ballad tempo, maybe we go into a triplet feel. But even 60% was too exaggerated for that tempo. I actually did, when I was a master's student, I worked on a music programming system where you could do all sorts of fun tweaks to things that now, I know how to do within MuseScore or other things. But one of the things I did was just listen to eighth notes, and then I would like program in different swing ratios so that it could hear it. And I would put in actual jazz pieces and listen to them and hear, well, what does it sound like if I play this piece with different swing ratios, and discover that it's really a function of tempo, and that at medium tempos, somewhere around 56% is what sounds the best. Maybe at this tempo, maybe more like 57 or so, but 60 was too much. But the faster the tempo, the straighter you want your eighth notes. And this is something that, it's not like I can, as a musician, calculate, oh, I'm going to play the first note 57% of the beat. Here's 57. It's something that just sort of, it's like an accent. If you grow up in a particular region of your country, and you like in America, like if I grew up in Louisiana, I would have a particular accent that anyone who knows the United States would be able to say, oh, he's from Louisiana. I think probably I don't know if people can tell where I grew up. You all know I live in Colorado now, but I didn't grow up here. Some of you might know where I grew up, but I don't know how apparent it is in my voice. But most countries have something similar, right? Different regional accents. And you can try to get rid of it, but it's there. Well, that's the way swing is for a jazz musician. It's like an accent that you grow up playing jazz, you're going to have this swing accent. You can get rid, you can, and if you grow up playing classical music too, then you know how to talk with that accent. You can get rid of it. But you're never, if you didn't, if you don't have, if you're not immersed in playing jazz, your swing is going to sound like, me trying to sound German. I can speak a little German. I can try my best to not have an American accent, but I'm going to fail miserably. Just totally miserably. Any German who hears me speaking German will say, "Oh, that's an American," of course. And it's the same, unfortunately, when you ask a typical classical orchestra to swing. You get something that does not sound like swing at all. That's just a fact of life. But anyhow, in MuseScore, you can try to tweak this by playing with those swing ratios. When it comes to the actual musicians, you just have to hope you've got enough jazz people in your orchestra to get a reasonable sound. So anyhow, I've talked about a whole bunch of things. So writing swing is one thing, but this idea of these adding sixths, adding ninths, using these minor four chords, using this flatted ninth, using that sharp 5 here, or flat 13, and this whole drop 2 plus 4 technique to open up voicings using passing diminished chords. All of these are sounds that are jazz arrangers. It's jazz arranging 101 is what I'm talking about here. And yet most of these skills, most of these things came in some sense from classical music, but they get, you see them and then you never think about using them again. They're obscure techniques, but they don't need to be obscure. They're things you can use. The last thing I want to mention, I keep saying last thing, but is a thing that I know if I had been able to find my I'm going to take 1 second to try to find my Rhapsody in Blue arrangement. So bear with me. The Rhapsody in Blue arrangement, I think if I go, I wish I know I had it somewhere at one time, and I wish I remembered where it was. But the idea was that I had this arrangement of Rhapsody in Blue 4-string quartet that I created, and if I had it, I could show you a couple things that Gershwin did. So teaching to write a song, yes, I can do that, but not in a few minutes here. So I am developing an online course specifically for teaching different skills. Oh, what the hell? I don't know what I just did. But okay, I don't think I'm going to find it. But what I would like to point out is there's a particular chord voicing for an A7 chord that looks like this. It's got the 7th of the chord, and then the 3rd of the chord, and then the 6th of the chord. And the root isn't even in the chord. Maybe it's in the left hand, maybe a bass player is playing it. Gershwin uses this kind of pretty prominently in Rhapsody in Blue. And it's a thing that we associate with modern jazz pianists, within the last 50 years, not the last 100 years. And so I don't know if Gershwin got it from listening to a jazz pianist or if jazz pianists ended up getting it from Gershwin, but this particular sound, 7th, 3rd, 6th, is like a real typical jazz sound. If I play it, you're like, well, that doesn't sound like A7, but if I add an A down here to it, so that I hear the root, now we can hear it as an A7 chord with a 6th added. But this idea that the pianist might not be concerned with the root, that really we just need the upper part of the voicing, and then the pianist, maybe in your left hand you play that root, or maybe there's a bass player playing it. And the idea that you might create chord voicings that are really essentially rootless, and that you can separate out the root function from the rest of the chord. This is another jazz-ism that you can totally take. You can just let your winds in an orchestra only have these upper parts, so you can get your color tones in there and not use up all your instruments, and just say, you know what, I'm just going to let the tubas and the cellos have the root, and I'm going to let the entire winds be upper parts of the voicing. You can totally do that. Okay, so that's a Gershwin, a technique that I don't know if Gershwin invented or who he stole it from, but it's another one of these things that's like the jazz hamburger. It's jazz, but it's not. It doesn't have to just be jazz. Anyhow, lots that I've talked about here. So hopefully some of you find some of this useful. And I keep saying that I think we're getting close to releasing MuseScore 3.5, or at least having like a beta version, or maybe even an alpha version. And Howard, I believe maybe if you're still here, I believe I heard on the chat that we're looking at this week for this alpha version. So if that does happen, then I expect that next week I'm going to demo some of the new stuff in MuseScore 3.5, because there's only a couple big things, but there are a couple fairly big things like chord symbol playback and some new editing things. Like I think apparently it'll be possible to just drag the end of a hairpin and have it automatically change its length the way you would expect it to. Some other miscellaneous things, but lots of little things too. And so there'll be lots to explore about it. And then the whole idea with the alpha release is that it's not the real release yet, but we want people to download it and start testing it, because that way when the real release comes out, we know we found the bugs. And it's so important that people realize that this is how software gets tested, especially open source software. It's not like there's people being paid to sit around and test it. We, the users, the really engaged users, are how we test things, and that's why we put out these like alpha versions and beta versions and pre-release versions, so that the people who want can help us with the testing of these things and report some bugs, so that by the time the real release goes out to the general public, there's some chance that it works well. So my face looks totally frozen on my computer over here, and I don't know why, but I still hear myself talking over here, so I'm assuming that it's actually still working. Anyhow, I'm going to wrap up, and I expect that next week I'll be talking about the MuseScore 3.5 alpha, and hopefully to get you excited to try out some of the new things. So I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy, and